There is a persistent misconception among many people that there is a basic animosity between religion and the world of science. Yet, for many centuries, the Catholic Church has supported scientific investigation by encouraging both clerics and laymen to investigate how and why God's universe works the way it does. Welcome to another episode of Mysteries of the Church. I'm your host, Carolyn Morrison, inviting you to join us as we investigate the long and complex relationship between the Church and scientific investigation.
I really think it's unfortunate that people mistakenly believe that religion and science, faith and reason don't go together. Because in fact, as we look at the history of the Church, and as we look at the involvement of people of the Church in science, we find that that's completely other. We find that religion and science have always gone together. If we look at the intellectual history of Western Europe, we find ourselves at a watershed, at a point in the history of Europe that's called the Enlightenment. The challenge of the Enlightenment was that the over-exclusive focus on the power of the human intellect made us forget that there was a truth about reality, that there are truths about the world and our place in it that are well beyond the ability of our intellects to understand on their own.
We have been kind of brainwashed into thinking somehow science reaches a truth that other stances, other perspectives don't reach, and that's the problem. People think that science is the truth, and if you're religious, that's fine, but that's terribly subjective.
Scripture scholars already in the 19th century were saying that we need to recognize that the books of the Bible are books of faith. They come out of faith. They were not meant to be scientific textbooks. They were not meant to be history textbooks, strictly speaking. There is a lot of history in the Bible, but there's also a lot of, you might say, stories that come out of imagination, but it's imagination driven by faith.
Both Christianity and science are complementary because they deal in the same matter, truth. The Bible contains truth. Science contains truth. The Bible contains knowledge. Science contains knowledge. But they both go about that knowledge, they both express that knowledge in a different way.
Well, one of the most basic definitions of theology is that it is faith seeking understanding. And so then, if we want to understand God as the creator, we also want to understand this marvelous creation that he has given us.
So they're both pursuing truth, but the popular image is somehow science is more objective than religion is. I would say no. So science is as subjective as religion. By that I mean all truth is truth for human persons.
I think that people of faith and people of science, actually, they, in a sense, they both come out of a wonderment and awe at the vastness and mysteries of creation. And that scientists try to calculate cause and effect. They try to measure, they try to predict on the basis of various laws what may happen. Whereas people of faith, they express their awe, their wonderment through worship, through belief, through devotion, through charity. So in a sense, it's two different approaches, two necessary approaches to the universe and to God.
It would seem that faith and science can indeed work hand in hand to uncover the mysteries of the universe, and in so doing, bring us closer to God. Stay with us for the next segment, where when we will look at specific examples of how the Church has encouraged investigation of the physical world. Most people think of the Middle Ages as a time of intellectual stagnation and scientific ignorance, but nothing could be further from the truth. While the monarchs of Europe were busy fighting wars and building kingdoms, the Church was actively encouraging investigation into the new and exciting world of study known as natural philosophy, what we now call science. Nearly all scientific investigation during the Middle Ages took place in monasteries and universities, both of which were an extension of the Catholic Church.
I think it's important to recognize that during the Middle Ages, the Church, de facto, with the collapse of other institutions in the West, found itself the custodian of the entire intellectual heritage of Western humankind, so that the Church was that institution that cultivated learning.
Well, in the Middle Ages, there was what you might call a natural philosophy. The Middle Ages were not Dark Ages. They were actually a time of great wisdom and scientific advance.
It would be the clerics themselves who would be out studying these things, because in that environment, it had been the clerics who actually would have had the education to do science. And among the work that they had done, of course, involved research into natural philosophy, which basically we would call earth science, general science.
And in analyzing the intricacies of the laws of nature and the way in which the universe was so marvelously put together, the analysis of the how that took place under the auspices of the Church ultimately led the investigators to marvel at the why, at the great beauty and the intricacy with which the universe was put together. So it's no surprise that so many scientific discoveries took place under the aegis of the Church.
In the medieval period, it was always the idea that theology was the queen of all sciences, and philosophy had been its handmaid. As this subjectivism is introduced, it's almost like degrees of knowledge, and that this is opposite of this, and unless you can prove something in this way, it's not truth.
There were attempts to try to understand how the world works at that time. Thomas Aquinas, again, gave us some of Aristotle's and his own thinking in terms of how the cosmos is constructed and the basic flow of life. So there were already some basic attempts at that.
Looking at a writer like St. Thomas, Thomas would be able to say to us, there are mysteries in this universe. We would be able to grasp and figure out certain things, problems, if you will.
St. Thomas's basic principle was, wherever there is truth, we accept it. Wherever there is error, we reject it. St. Thomas had an interesting way of arguing. He first presented the error. God does not exist because, then he'd give 3 reasons why it looks as though God doesn't exist. Then he would say, however, I say, and then he would say his position, and then answer the 3 reasons. So it's a great way to teach, and it's a great way to learn.
And he suggests that through the powers of observation, human beings, through doing the sorts of things that human beings can ultimately come to understand that there must be a God, through the evidence that there is for the existence of God that exists in creation.
Well, see, in the Middle Ages, one of the great discoveries, or you might say rediscovery, was the rediscovery of the Greek philosophers, of someone like Aristotle, who was a philosopher, but also in a sense a scientist as well. So someone like St. Thomas Aquinas brings Aristotle into people's awareness, and people now, in a sense, can build on Aristotle's, granted, primitive work as a scientist, but nevertheless, people can start building on that.
Catholicism has always been in favor of science. Whenever people talk about a conflict between the two, I can guarantee you immediately the name of Galileo is going to be mentioned.
The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, said Galileo, not how the heavens go. In so saying, he's marking out the proper distinction between the biblical narratives and the evidence that comes to us from experimental science. It's important to recognize that Galileo understood himself as a faithful Christian throughout his life and throughout the controversies that he experienced. And he saw nothing of what he did as being at odds with his faith as a Catholic Christian.
The history of this big controversial Galileo Galilei versus Pope Urban VIII is an absolutely fascinating case of two people getting their backs up when there really didn't seem to be a reason to do that.
Galileo was, again, somebody who was controversial because he was trying to develop the theory that you know, the Earth circles the sun. It's not the sun that circles the Earth. And of course, it was not totally new, but still, it was somewhat revolutionary.
And in fact, when he presents that knowledge to Pope Urban VIII, well, Pope Urban VIII is impressed.
Initially, Pope Urban VIII and Galileo got along fine. As a matter of fact, Galileo was almost a protege of Pope Urban VIII. He was defending as a theory the Copernican vision, the heliocentric vision, in other words, that the Earth revolves around the sun. As long as he defended it as a theory, there was no problem at all.
So what he winds up doing is issuing some pretty, I guess we'd call them sarcastic comments about Pope Urban VIII. And that's not something you would do to a pope of this time period. The house arrest by Pope Urban VIII of Galileo really is done, I think, in Pope Urban VIII's mind, not out of spite, but to teach someone humility. He's told, you spend this time in repentance, you spend this time in prayer. But ultimately, I would hate to think that Pope Urban VIII did it out of spite. I think he probably saw it as much more of a pedagogical tool of getting him to learn and to develop more fully the virtue of humility.
But in recent years, both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict have regretted that move against Galileo, and have said that it was unfortunate, again, due to people's limited understanding at that time. And so, in a sense, Galileo has been reinstated as, you know, that he was a man of faith and a man who was genuinely searching for understanding.
During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Church fostered the vast majority of scientific and philosophical work through monastic houses scattered across Europe. But by the modern age, most educated men and women were no longer members of the clergy. Does this mean that the Church ceased being involved with the world of science? To find out the answer, stay with us when Mysteries of the Church continues in just a moment. As we have seen, the Church has actively supported the freedom of scientific thought and investigation since its earliest years. Throughout the Middle Ages, Church-run universities produced the greatest thinkers and fostered their investigation into every imaginable field of science and philosophy, including the very nature of God, creation, and the universe. In 1870, the First Vatican Council decreed that faith and reason are complementary during a time when a number of clerics produced scientific work so outstanding that it paved the way for much of our modern science.
Well, Father Mendel was the first, actually, you might say, of a series of Catholic priests and Catholic laity who were pioneers in science. So, so much of what is done today is based on the work, for example, of Father Mendel regarding genetics. But there were others too over the decades, from the 19th century into our own time, who have been in the forefront of scientific discoveries.
Father Mendel, in this time period, in the 19th century, stumbles across, through his own personal research, the concept of genetic theory, because he wasn't necessarily doing this to publish a paper. He wasn't doing this as a professional scientist. Remember, he was a Benedictine monk. He was a high school, basically, science teacher. After years and years of cross-pollination of all these different crops and all these different flowers, how come they ultimately don't all merge into this one thing? And so over about 7 years of study and research, he discovers the theory of genetics. It's no mistake that something as key as gene theory comes from a man who happens to be a Benedictine monk.
I think it requires a terrific commitment to do that kind of work alone, and no one ever says, you know, we appreciate what you're doing, or we see that you, and matter of fact, they may even say to you, you're all wrong. This is, you know, you're doing research, it's not going to get anywhere. You've got to really be a person of commitment to stay with it.
We look at someone like Mendel producing this and writing this paper on the hybridization of these pea plants, and let's face it, it doesn't strike most people as the most interesting or most important topic, you know, how things grow. So years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, some scientists just happened to find this Benedictine monk's work and say, you know what, he's right.
So this whole idea that somehow religion is opposed to science, here's a Catholic priest making really important discoveries. He's actually called the father of genetics.
The history of science is filled with unheralded pioneers, with people who made the initial discoveries on which subsequent generations of scientific inquiry have built, and who go unheralded, who didn't win the Nobel Prize for physics, who didn't win the Nobel Prize for chemistry, who predated even the establishment of those recognitions.
One of the most important priests, men of faith, who happened also to be an incredible scientist, was Father George Lemaitre.
I think Lemaitre is a good example of pursuing theology and believing in revelation. On the other hand, also totally committed to the scientific pursuit.
He's ordained a priest, and he begins to be fascinated by Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. And from this point, he traces this back to this central action in which the universe starts to grow and change and expand. And really, in many ways, he's able to bring both the concept of order in the universe to this dynamic theory that had been relatively new in terms of Albert Einstein.
13 billion years ago, there was an explosion, that there was some very intense matter that suddenly exploded and gave birth to our universe.
Now, the Big Bang theory, the theory of the physical origin of the cosmos, suggests that it all got started, everything all got started with this primordial Big Bang. And from there, the rest is cosmic history. The history of the diversification, the history of the formation of planetary systems, of galaxies, and ultimately of life on Earth, and ultimately of human life on Earth.
So Lemaitre's discovery of the initial explosion, which has come to be called the Big Bang Theory, how does that fit in with Genesis? Do they work together? Well, they're really two different views. Genesis is giving us a religious view, which I believe is true, and Lemaitre, in his scientific pursuit, he's giving us a scientific explanation. So they do not contradict one another. That's the main point. They're doing two different disciplines there.
What becomes difficult is, I think, is to reconcile faith in the Big Bang Theory. But again, there really should be no problem, because God creates the fundamental material and the direction of the universe, and guides that universe ever more toward greater life. And so our faith in God as creator does not conflict with the Big Bang Theory.
I would say Lemaitre's explanation is not that something has come from nothing. You know, there is an atom there. So my view, what I try to explain philosophically would be the atom's created by God, the explosion is created by God. You know, he was on a panel one time with Einstein, and he was basically defending a view that was different from Einstein's. And at the end of it, Einstein got up and said, "That is one of the most beautiful presentations I've ever heard in my life."
The widespread misconception that the church and science are in some way opposed to each other has carried on throughout the centuries. Yet it has been popes and ranking churchmen who have believed it is our duty to explore every corner of God's universe, from the astoundingly tiny world of the microscopic to the awe-inspiring vastness of space. So in light of this knowledge, how should modern scientists, as well as laymen, view the relationship between the church and scientific inquiry? For the answer, stay with us. Mysteries of the Church will be right back. As science has increased the sum of mankind's knowledge, the Church has continued to accept these new findings and encourage scientists to ever greater achievements in the hope that the more we know about God's universe, the closer we come to understanding the true nature of God and His plan for mankind. So how can investigating the nature of the universe, the world around us, and even the human body help bring us closer to an understanding of God's plan?
When we look to some of these great men throughout all of history who were important contributors to science, that used their own vocation, their own faith as the starting point really to their own scientific research, we can see quite clearly that these two worlds, they're not in opposition, they're complementary.
If we look to the contributions to science, to the many different sciences that were advanced not only by Catholic Christians, by Christians of other faith communities, we can very clearly understand that there is a faith-based motivation for the way in which they approach their work as scientists. They want to understand the wonderment of it all as God put it together.
And it's that same wonder and awe that a man like Einstein felt about science that ultimately had its origin in the way he felt about his relationship with his God. The thing we always need to realize when it comes to someone like Albert Einstein was that he was a believer. He was a devout believer in God.
I think that many of the great scientists were driven by faith, and they probably had to struggle also at times to reconcile their struggles or their discoveries and faith. But some of the great scientists, like Einstein, saw that God is at work in the universe.
And by their discoveries, they're helping human beings to understand the universe in which we live, the predicament in which we find ourselves. They're discovering solutions, treatments for illnesses. They're helping to alleviate human sufferings, all in keeping with the will of the God in whom they themselves may or may not believe. They're doing God's work just the same. Never once does astronomy, never once does scientific cosmology come close to being able to answer the question of why the universe came to be. Jews and Christians and Muslims and so many others believe that the why has to do with the providence of God the Creator, who brought the cosmos into being.
I think we need to do a better job in helping our Catholic people to understand that science in itself is not a threat to our faith, and help the Catholic people to understand that the Church has generally favored science. So remember, for example, that our great Catholic universities, not only in the United States, but around the world, have departments of science or faculties for science. And so scientific research is encouraged, discovery is encouraged, dialogue is encouraged.
I think science and religion should go together because both should be ideally committed to truth. See, a religion that is not committed to truth ultimately is worthless.
And when Christians read the book of Genesis, we're not reading it as though it were a manual that describes in scientific terms the origin of the universe. Thus, reading the book of Genesis as a way of reflecting on why God brought reality into being, on why God created the universe, and on why we are in relationship to God and with the rest of God's creation as we are. That's why we read the book of Genesis. But we turn to physicists, we turn to astronomers, we turn to scientific cosmologists, we turn to evolutionary biologists to understand how this wonder came to be and continues to be held in being.
Ultimately, whether they're studying the truth that comes as revealed in the Bible, the truth that comes and revealed throughout the dogmatic teaching in the church, the truth that's expressed in prayer and liturgy and spirituality, or the truth that's expressed in history, or whether that even be the truth that's expressed in through chemistry, through botany, through biology, through physics, whatever it might be, we're all dealing in the same thing, and it's truth. And we need to see that the origin and author of truth is ultimately God.
Far from being intimidated or frightened by science, Christians should rejoice in the fact that virtually all scientific findings strongly support the concept that we live in a universe designed according to God's grand plan. Father Lemaitre, who proposed the Big Bang Theory, wisely said, "Does the church need science? Certainly not. The cross and the gospel are enough." However, how could the church not be interested in the most noble of all strictly human occupations, namely the search for the truth? Thank you for watching. I'm Carolyn Morrison, and I hope you join us again next time for another episode of Mysteries of the Church.